How much weight could dignity bear before it splintered like old wood? An Jin-ho didn't know the exact measure, but he felt the strain in the marrow of his 68-year-old bones, a deeper ache than the late autumn chill biting through his thin jacket. He pedalled the battered delivery bicycle, each rotation a grunt of metal and muscle against the indifferent Seoul afternoon. Parcels, anonymous boxes filled with the transient desires of others, rattled in the oversized basket strapped precariously behind him. His cargo was the pulse of the modern city, fast, demanding, disposable. He, however, felt increasingly like the packaging, destined to be discarded once its contents were consumed. The sleek glass towers of Jongno clawed at the grey sky, reflecting a distorted image of the bustling street below, a world Jin-ho felt increasingly alien to, despite having lived his entire life within its embrace. The acrid tang of exhaust fumes stung his nostrils, a harsh counterpoint to the phantom scent of pine and cedar that sometimes drifted through his memory, faint and elusive like a half-forgotten dream. 40 years he'd spent coaxing life and form from timber, his hands reading the secret language of the grain, shaping joists and rafters for hanok, traditional Korean houses that breathed with the seasons. His workshop, small but respected, had hummed with the rhythm of saw and chisel. Now his hands, still strong but mapped with the calluses of unfamiliar labour, gripped the cold handlebars, guiding his clumsy vessel through the relentless current of traffic. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of progress, delivering its parcels. His final delivery done, Jin-ho navigated the bicycle back towards the warren of alleys that constituted Ixion-dong. Once a quiet neighbourhood of tiled roofs and shared courtyards, it was now a schizophrenic maze where trendy cafes with minimalist concrete facades nestled jarringly against aging hanok, clinging stubbornly to existence. Tourists with selfie sticks navigated the narrow lanes, seeking curated authenticity, oblivious to the lives quietly unfolding or unravelling behind the picturesque doorways. Jin-ho's room was in one of the latter, a small, damp space at the back of a house whose original owners had long since departed. He parked the bicycle, the chain groaning in protest, and climbed the worn wooden steps. Inside, the air was cold. The meagre afternoon sun barely penetrated the single small window. He switched on the bare overhead bulb, illuminating peeling wallpaper and a floor stained with the ghosts of past occupants. His possessions were few: a thin mattress, a portable gas stove, a small pile of folded clothes, and, tucked away in a corner, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, a select few of his old woodworking tools, a plane, a set of chisels, a marking gauge, relics of a former self. He heated water for instant ramyeon, the steam briefly warming his face. Eating alone had become a ritual stripped of comfort, merely fuel. He remembered evenings filled with the scent of his wife Mi-jung's cooking, the sound of her laughter mingling with the radio's tune. 10 years she'd been gone. Their son, Min-jun, was a world away in Canada, his calls infrequent, strained by Jin-ho's prideful insistence that everything was fine. How could he explain this? The slow erosion of a life's work, the indignity of scraping by? Impossible. The silence in the room pressed in, broken only by the slurp of noodles. Current part characters, 398 total characters, 13,898. The next morning arrived not with promise, but with a curt summons from the delivery company manager. A young man, barely older than Jin-ho's son, sat behind a particle board desk, avoiding eye contact. Restructuring, he mumbled, fiddling with a pen. Efficiency targets. We have to let some part-timers go. He slid an envelope containing Jin-ho's meagre final pay across the desk. The unspoken reason hung heavy in the air. Age. Slowness. Jin-ho was obsolete code in their streamlined system. He didn't argue. What was the point? The carefully constructed dam of his pride felt another fissure. He walked out into the grey morning, the envelope feeling both flimsy and leaden in his pocket. As if summoned by the scent of misfortune, his landlord, Mr. Bay, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, caught him near the gate later that day. "Ah, Mr. An!" Just the man. He waved a formal-looking letter. About the rent. You know how things are. Property values rising, renovations next door. Starting next month, it will be. He named a figure 30% higher than Jin-ho currently paid. 30%. An impossible sum. Area improvements, Mr. Bai added, adjusting his glasses, his gaze sliding past Jin-ho towards the newly opened fusion restaurant down the alley. Jinho felt the ground shift beneath him, jobless, facing eviction. The city, which had once felt like the solid bedrock of his existence, now seemed poised to swallow him whole. Days blurred into a demoralizing cycle. Jinho scanned online job boards, the tiny print blurring before his eyes. He visited community centers, picking up flyers for positions that evaporated upon inquiry. Security guard? We need someone. More active, the interviewer said, barely glancing at Jinho's application detailing decades of responsibility. Cleaner? Requires lifting, long hours on your feet. Kitchen help? Fast-paced environment. The unspoken word always present. Old. Each rejection was a small hammer blow, chipping away at the remaining fragments of his self-worth. He walked the streets, no longer delivering parcels but adrift, observing the city's relentless energy with a growing sense of detachment. He saw the intricate joinery on the eaves of surviving Hanok, the subtle curve of a roofline, details most people hurried past. His hands, shoved deep in his pockets, itched with the memory of shaping wood, of bringing order and beauty from raw material. Now they felt useless, clumsy appendages. One afternoon, wandering through the familiar labyrinth of Ixeondong, seeking refuge from the biting wind, he stopped before a small, slightly dilapidated hanok housing a quiet tea shop. The wooden lattice panel beside the door was damaged, crudely patched with wire and tape. An offence to the eye, to the wood itself. Almost unconsciously, his fingers probed the split timber, assessed the failed joint. Years of ingrained knowledge surfaced. With a few deft movements, using only his hands and a small twig found on the ground, he managed to temporarily realign the broken pieces, restoring a semblance of the original pattern. It was a small, instinctive act of order in his chaotic world. He didn't notice the young woman sitting on a low wall nearby, sketchbook open on her lap, watching him with quiet intensity. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. Jinho started, pulling his hand back as if caught doing something illicit. The young woman stood up, approaching him hesitantly. She was perhaps 23, dressed in practical layers against the cold, her eyes bright with curiosity. "What you just did, with the lattice. How did you know how to fit it back together like that?" Jinho eyed her warily. Students often sketched in Ixeondong, drawn by the photogenic decay. "It was broken," he mumbled, turning to leave. "Wait," she persisted, stepping into his path. "I'm studying architecture. Kang So-yeon." She offered a slight bow. "I'm researching traditional Hanok construction. That joint, the way you handled it. You're a carpenter, aren't you?" The question hung in the air. A carpenter. The title felt like a phantom limb, aching with absence. "I used to be," Jinho said curtly, the words tasting like sawdust and regret. He tried to move past her again, but So-yeon was persistent. "Please, Seonsangnim," she used the respectful term for teacher. "Could I ask you some questions? My textbooks, they explain the forms but not the feeling, the technique. Like that lattice." Jinho hesitated. Her earnestness, the genuine respect in her eyes, chipped at his gruff exterior. It had been years since anyone had looked at him and seen a craftsman, not just an old man. Still, the bitterness was strong. "There's nothing to tell. Nobody cares about this old way anymore," he said, finally brushing past her and disappearing down the alley, leaving So-yeon staring after him, her sketchbook momentarily forgotten. But So-yeon didn't give up easily. A few days later, she found him again, sitting on a bench in a small, overlooked pocket park, nursing a cheap cup of coffee from a vending machine. This time, she came prepared. She had visited the local community office, inquired at the tea shop whose lattice he'd mended. She had found his name, An Jinho. And she had found a faded photograph online, attached to an old article about the restoration of a small temple gate on the outskirts of Seoul years ago. The article praised the meticulous work of master carpenter An Jinho. She showed him the printout. Jinho stared at the image of his younger self, standing proudly beside the finished gate, his tools in hand, Mi-jung smiling beside him. A wave of memory, sharp and painful, washed over him. "They tore that gate down last year," he said, his voice flat, "for a new apartment complex." So-yeon looked crestfallen. "Oh, I didn't know." She paused. "But the work itself, it's beautiful. The joinery is incredible." She opened her sketchbook, showing him her drawings, technically proficient but lacking something. "I'm trying to understand the gyeogu, the interlocking joints. My professor says it's key, but I can't grasp how they achieve such strength without nails, especially the complex angled ones. Jin-Ho looked at her sketches. He saw the mistakes, the misunderstanding of how the wood's tension and grain worked together. Against his better judgment, a lifetime of ingrained knowledge stirred. He took the pencil she offered, his calloused fingers surprisingly steady. "No, not like that," he began, his voice rough but clear. "The tension must flow this way. You have to account for the seasonal swelling." He started sketching, correcting her lines, explaining the principles his own master had taught him decades ago. So-yeon listened intently, her eyes wide, absorbing every word. For a short while, An Jin-ho wasn't just an unemployed old man on a park bench. He was a master sharing his craft. Their meetings became a tentative routine. So-yeon would find him, sometimes in the park, sometimes nursing a coffee in a cheap noodle shop. She brought him sketches, questions, sometimes a warm sweet potato or a can of coffee, small gestures he accepted with gruff nods. He remained guarded, revealing little about his current circumstances, but the act of sharing his knowledge seemed to rekindle a dormant spark within him. He spoke of wood as if it were alive, explaining the personalities of different timbers, the patience required, the respect the material demanded. So-yeon, in turn, shared her frustrations with modern architectural trends, her admiration for the endurance and ecological wisdom of traditional methods. An unlikely bridge was forming across the chasm of generations and circumstances. Then came the request that shifted their dynamic. So-yeon was struggling with a crucial part of her thesis project, constructing an accurate, detailed scale model of a particularly complex dopo joint, a multi-layered bracket system used in traditional roof structures. "I've tried," she confessed, showing him photos of her failed attempts, pieces poorly cut, joints misaligned. "The professor says the model needs to be perfect to demonstrate the structural integrity. I just can't get it right." She hesitated, then plunged ahead. Seon sang-nim, "I know it's odd to ask, but could you possibly make it for me? I have a small budget from my part-time job. I can pay you." Jin-Ho recoiled as if stung. "Make a toy?" The words were sharp with wounded pride. "I built houses, temples, not dollhouse parts." The thought of using his skills, honed over decades for a student's model, felt like a final humiliation. He saw the hurt flicker in So-yeon's eyes. "It's not a toy," she said quietly. "It's to show people, to help them understand how brilliant this construction method is, to preserve the knowledge." She looked down at her hands. "And maybe I was hoping to learn by watching you work." Jin-Ho fell silent. He thought of the looming rent increase, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, the cold indifference of the job market. He looked at So-yeon's earnest face, her genuine respect for the craft he thought the world had forgotten. Was pride a luxury he could no longer afford? And perhaps touching the tools again, feeling the wood yield to his skill, even on this small scale, perhaps it wouldn't be entirely demeaning. "How much?" he asked gruffly, avoiding her gaze. So-yeon named a figure. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover a week's rent, but it was more than he had earned in days. He nodded slowly. "All right, bring me the detailed plans and the wood. Proper wood, mind you, not that flimsy balsa." A flicker of something akin to hope, fragile and unfamiliar, stirred within him. The next day, So-yeon arrived at his room with rolls of architectural drawings and carefully selected pieces of miniature lumber, basswood and cherry, small but true. Jin-Ho cleared a space on his small table, unrolling the plans. Then he went to the corner and slowly unwrapped the oiled cloth bundle. The chisels gleamed faintly in the dim light, their edges still keen despite years of disuse. He picked up his favorite marking gauge, its wooden body worn smooth by decades of handling. He ran his thumb over the brass fitting. It felt like shaking hands with an old, trusted friend. Meticulously, he studied the plans, translating the two-dimensional lines into a three-dimensional challenge in his mind. He began marking the tiny pieces of wood, his movements economical, precise. So-yeon watched in fascinated silence, occasionally sketching in her notebook. The room filled with the soft rasp of a fine-toothed saw, the tap-tap-tap of a small mallet on a chisel handle. Jin-Ho worked slowly, methodically. His hands, initially stiff, gradually remembered their old fluency. The frustration of his recent life seemed to recede, replaced by an intense focus, a dialogue between mind, hand, and material. He felt the familiar satisfaction of a clean cut, the precision of a perfectly marked line. But it wasn't easy. His eyesight wasn't as sharp as it once was. He had to hold the small pieces close. His back ached from bending over the low table. Doubt gnawed at him. Could he still do this? Was he just fooling himself? An old man playing with blocks? Yet, as the intricate components of the doper joint began to take shape, tiny tenons fitting snugly into miniature mortises, a forgotten sense of purpose flowed back into him. He wasn't just assembling wood, he was reconnecting with the core of his identity. The work progressed over several days. Jinho's small room transformed into a miniature workshop. Fine sawdust coated the floor. The air held the clean scent of cut wood, masking the usual faint odour of damp. So-yeon became his quiet apprentice, anticipating his needs, holding pieces steady, cleaning sawdust with a soft brush, asking thoughtful questions about the sequence of assembly, the logic behind each angle and notch. She brought him food, hot soup, rice balls, simple meals they shared in comfortable silence or amidst discussions about grain direction and structural load paths. Jinho found himself talking more, sharing anecdotes from his workshop days, explaining the philosophy behind hanok design, its harmony with nature, its resilience. He learned about So-yeon too, her passion for sustainable architecture, her frustration with developers who prioritized profit over heritage, her quiet determination to make a difference. An unspoken understanding grew between them, a bond forged over shared respect for the craft. But the outside world couldn't be kept at bay indefinitely. The rent deadline loomed closer, a menacing date circled on Jinho's mental calendar. The money from So-yeon wouldn't be enough on its own. He forced himself back to the job search, enduring another round of polite but firm rejections. One rainy afternoon, returning soaked and disheartened from a failed interview for a night watchman position, we found someone younger. He found an official-looking notice slipped under his door. It wasn't from his landlord this time, but from the district office. A preliminary notice regarding potential redevelopment plans for this specific block of Ixion-dong. Surveys would begin soon. Nothing definite, the paper stated, but the implication was clear. The old buildings, including the one housing his room, were living on borrowed time. The news struck him like a physical blow. Even this last refuge, this cramped room that held the remnants of his life, was precarious. The city wasn't just neglecting him, it was actively erasing the spaces he inhabited. That evening, frustration and despair settled over him like a shroud. He stared at the half-finished model joint on his table, its intricate beauty suddenly seeming pointless, fragile. What was the use of preserving this knowledge in miniature when the full-scale reality was being demolished? His back throbbed, a dull echo of his failing body and dwindling prospects. He picked up a chisel, intending to work, but his hand trembled slightly. A wave of weariness washed over him. Maybe he should just give up. Take whatever scraps the world offered. Forget the pride, forget the craft, just survive. He almost swept the delicate wooden pieces off the table. Just then, there was a soft knock. It was So-yeon, holding a small thermos. "I thought you might like some hot tea, Seon-seung-nim," she said, her smile hesitant. She saw the notice from the district office lying on the floor, saw the despair in his eyes, the tremor in his hand holding the chisel. She didn't offer platitudes. Instead, she carefully poured the tea, its fragrant steam rising in the chilly air. She looked at the model. "It's starting to look incredible," she said softly. "Seeing it come together, it makes all the drawings and theories real. It shows how much thought, how much skill went into designing something so strong and beautiful." She looked at him directly. "Your work matters, Seon-seung-nim. This knowledge, it shouldn't be lost." Her simple, genuine words cut through his despair. It wasn't pity, it was belief. Belief in him, in the value of what he knew, what he could do. He looked from her earnest face to the intricate wooden puzzle on the table. It was small, yes. It wouldn't change the world, wouldn't pay the rent indefinitely, wouldn't stop the bulldozers. But it was his. It was a testament. A final, defiant act of creation against the forces that sought to render him invisible. He gripped the chisel again, the tremor lessening. "Pass me the small file," he said, his voice rough but steady. "This curve needs refining." Sleep became secondary. Aches were ignored or endured. His focus narrowed to the task at hand, the precise angle of a cut, the smooth finish of a surface, the seamless fit of one tiny wooden element against another. So-yeon was his constant shadow, assisting, documenting, learning. She sourced a specific type of traditional paper he needed for wrapping a miniature tenon, tracked down a rare miniature file when his own proved too coarse, and ensured he ate and drank. They worked mostly in silence, punctuated by technical instructions or brief explanations. The air crackled with concentration. It was more than just assembling a model. It felt like reconstructing a piece of Jin-ho himself. He poured into it the accumulated knowledge of 40 years, the muscle memory stored in his hands, the aesthetic sensibility honed by countless hours spent observing and shaping wood. He worked not just for the meager payment, or even for So-yeon's thesis, but for himself. To prove, perhaps only to himself, that the master carpenter An Jin-ho still existed beneath the worn clothes of the unemployed old man. The evening before the rent was due, he fitted the final piece into place. The complex dopo joint stood complete on the table, a marvel of miniature engineering and artistry. Each layer, each bracket, each interlocking piece fit perfectly, embodying the principles of load distribution and aesthetic harmony that defined traditional Korean architecture. It was small, barely spanning the width of his two hands, yet it held the weight of centuries of craftsmanship. It wasn't flawless. Jin-ho saw the minute imperfections invisible to any other eye, concessions to his aging sight and stiffening fingers, but it was honest work. It held integrity. He ran a finger gently over a smooth curve, the wood warm beneath his touch. A profound quiet settled over him, a sense of completion that transcended the physical object. So-yeon, who had been watching with bated breath, let out a soft sigh. "Seon-sang-nim," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's perfect." Jin-ho merely nodded, too weary and emotionally drained for words. He had done it. He had taken the fragments of his past and built something whole again, however small. The next morning, So-yeon returned. She handled the model with reverence before carefully placing it in a protective box she had brought. She handed Jin-ho an envelope containing the promised payment, plus a little extra she insisted was for materials. "Thank you, Seon-sang-nim," she said, bowing deeply. "This is more than just a model. You've taught me so much." Jin-ho accepted the envelope with a quiet nod. The money felt strangely insignificant compared to the journey of the past few days. "Use it well," he said. "Show them the strength in the old ways." So-yeon assured him she would. Her presentation was next week. She would emphasize the importance of preserving these techniques and the knowledge held by master craftsmen like him. She promised to credit him fully. "Perhaps," she added hesitantly, "if the professor likes it, maybe there could be other small projects, documenting other joints." Jin-ho didn't answer immediately. The thought was appealing, a sliver of possibility, but he knew better than to cling to false hope. "We'll see," he said finally. So-yeon understood. She thanked him again and left, the precious model held carefully in her hands. Jin-ho was alone again in the quiet room. The space where the model had sat seemed conspicuously empty. He held the envelope, the cash inside barely enough to cover the increased rent and leave a pittance for food. The redevelopment notice lay on the table, a stark reminder of his precarious reality. Nothing had fundamentally changed. He was still old, still poor, still facing an uncertain future in a city that seemed eager to forget him and the world he represented. He walked over to the window, looking out at the sliver of grey sky visible between the buildings. The sounds of Ikseondong drifted up, the chatter of tourists, the clatter from a nearby kitchen, the distant rumble of construction. His city, changing, evolving, sometimes erasing. He wasn't sure where he fit anymore. He picked up one of his old chisels, feeling its familiar weight. He ran his thumb over the worn wooden handle, polished smooth by years of use. He thought of the dopo joint, the clean lines, the satisfying click as the final piece slotted into place. It hadn't saved him, not in any material sense, but it had reminded him of who he was. He hadn't just been making a model, he had been reclaiming a piece of his soul. He found a small block of scrap wood left over from the project. Sitting down at the table, under the weak light of the bare bulb, An Jin-ho picked up his sharpest pencil. His hand, steady now, began to move across the surface of the wood. He wasn't sketching a grand temple or a sturdy house, just lines, curves, exploring the grain, remembering, echoes in wood, faint but persistent. The future remained a vast unknown, shrouded in the soul mist, but within the quiet confines of his small room, the carpenter had found for a moment his centre once more. The dignity, though heavily burdened, had not splintered. It held the grain. He paid the increased rent, the transaction brief and impersonal. Mr. Bai pocketed the money without comment, his eyes already calculating future profits from the neighbourhood's relentless gentrification. The immediate crisis was averted, but the underlying fragility remained. Jin-ho spent his days walking, observing the city with a changed perspective. He saw the hurried construction, the shortcuts taken, the soulless uniformity replacing the varied textures of the past. He saw the other elderly faces on the streets, some collecting cardboard, others sitting silently on benches, their stories hidden behind masks of resignation or forced cheerfulness. He felt a kinship with them, a shared understanding of being out of step with the relentless march of time and commerce. He occasionally revisited the tea shop with the mended lattice. The temporary fix he'd made was still holding, a small, anonymous act of care in a careless world. The owner, an elderly woman who remembered his workshop days, would sometimes offer him a free cup of barley tea, their conversation brief, acknowledging the shared passage of years and the changing landscape around them. A week later, So-yeon sought him out again, her face glowing. Her presentation had been a success. The professor, initially skeptical, had been captivated by the precision and beauty of the Doppo model. He had praised her research and the dedication it represented. He was especially impressed with the craftsmanship. Seon-sang nim, she reported eagerly. He asked who made it. I told him about you, about your experience. She handed him a small, elegantly wrapped gift. Inside was a high-quality set of Japanese sharpening stones. I noticed yours were quite worn, she said shyly. A craftsman needs the best tools, right? Jin-ho was momentarily speechless. It wasn't just the gift, thoughtful as it was, but the validation it represented. Someone had seen the value, not just in the object, but in the maker. He managed a gruff thank you, his voice thick with unexpressed emotion. So-yeon lingered, telling him about the positive feedback, the possibility of her thesis being published in a student journal. And the professor mentioned, she added almost casually, that the university's architectural archive sometimes commissions models of historical details for preservation studies. He took my contact information. It wasn't a job offer, not yet. Just a possibility, fragile as a wood shaving. But it was more than Jin-ho had allowed himself to hope for. He didn't suddenly find regular work. The systemic ageism hadn't vanished. The threat of redevelopment still hung over Icheon-dong like a persistent fog. But something had shifted within him. The bitterness hadn't disappeared entirely, but it was tempered now by the memory of focused work, the warmth of connection, the quiet affirmation of his skills. He started taking his old tools out more often, not just to clean them, but to hold them, to study them. He found discarded pieces of wood on his walks, examining their potential. In the evenings, instead of just staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper, he would sometimes sketch, details of joinery, the curve of a bracket, ideas taking shape on scraps of paper. He even began cautiously repairing small wooden items for neighbours in the older part of Icheon-dong. A wobbly chair leg, a loose window frame, accepting